Have a Bible in front of you this morning or a device, if you would join me in the book of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel will begin in chapter 8, and we will make our way through multiple chapters this morning as we look at the next of our characters, and we're going back into a portion where we're seeing a lot of the same people that are involved that we have seen in previous Sundays as we have looked especially at the lives of some of the folks in the Old Testament. So this morning, we're going to be looking at a man by the name of Johnathan. Johnathan was the son of Saul and the friend of David, and he's one of those people that we get to know in Scripture because of the special role that he played in the accomplishment of God's will. You know, one of the incredible things about this entire series is we think about just the reality that we are just ordinary people, that God chooses to say, I want you to be a part of what I'm doing in the world. I want to use you as an instrument to accomplish my will. And He does that in ways that often we don't even realize what's happening until after it's done. And some of the things we probably won't realize until we stand before Him in heaven and we look back over our lives and go, wow, I had no idea that's what you were doing, God. What an incredible thing that you are about. Johnathan was born not into a royal family, even though his father was the first king of Israel. Johnathan was born into a farming family. He was a farmer, his daddy was a farmer, his granddaddy was a farmer, they were all farmers. And likely, they were just going about doing farming things. In fact, what we discover in 1 Samuel chapter 8 is that's exactly what was going on. King Saul was doing farming things. He was going looking for his father's donkeys. If you've got your Bibles, look at 1 Samuel chapter 8. We're going to begin reading with verse 1. When Samuel became old. Now remember, we first met Samuel a few weeks ago because his mother Hannah had prayed for a son and prayed for a son and prayed for a son. And when she finally was given a son, they named him Samuel, and she committed him to the Lord. And so now he is an old man, and he has been a prophet, and he has been a judge over Israel for all of these years. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all of the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all of the other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done from this day forward, from the day I brought them up and out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Skip over to chapter 9. There was a man from Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zizor, the son of Bekorah, the son of Aphiah, the Benjamite, a man of wealth, and he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to his son Saul, Take one of the young men with you and arise, go and look for the donkeys. He passed through the hill country of Ephraim and passed through the land of Shalisha, but they did not find them. And they passed through the land of Shalim, but they were not there. Then they passed through the land of Benjamin, but did not find them. And when they came to the land of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, Come, let us go back, lest my father cease to care about the donkeys and become anxious about us. But he said to him, Behold, there is a man of God in this city. And he is a man who is held in honor. All that he says comes true. So now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way that we should go. Israel had been ruled by judges for something like 400 years. There had been judges who, since the passing of Joshua, there had been judges whom God had placed his hand upon them, anointed them, and brought them to positions of influence and leadership in the lives of the people. Samuel was the last of those judges. He tried to appoint his two sons to take over the work as he was getting old, but as we read in Scripture, they were not fit for the task. They were not up for what was going on. And so the people rejected God's rule over them. The idea was that no person should be in charge. That you should only have men who have a relationship with God, or women in that case, because you had both men and women serving as judges, and that they would seek the Lord's counsel and then do what was right for the people. And all through that period of time, the people would run after God, and God would meet their needs, and then they would fall away, and God would send another enemy, and they would then come back to God, and there was this constant back and forth. Sound familiar? Kind of like our lives, right? We have those moments where we're walking in fellowship with God, and we have those other moments where we're being rebellious and doing our own thing instead. And in chapter 8, what we discover is that Israel got restless. And they looked around at what everybody else had. And they said, we want some of that too. We want to have a king. We're tired of being invaded by all of these armies. They are invading us because we don't have a strong king. We don't have a strong military. We're just sitting here waiting for them to come and to plunder us. We want to be like all of the other countries. And God says, but you're not like all of the other nations. You have me. They don't have me. Samuel was this prophet. They went to him and they said, look, we don't want another judge. We want you to go to God and find us someone who will be king. So Samuel goes to God and he says, Lord, I'm mad with them. They're rejecting me. God says, no, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. And he says, Samuel, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give them what they want. They're not going to like what they get. We'll give them a king who will press their sons into military service. We will give them a king who will tax their land. We will give them a king who will take their daughters as his servants. We will give them what they want, but they will not want what they get. Church, hear me. We have to be careful what we ask for. We have to make sure that when we are asking God to meet the needs of our lives, whether it's for us individually, for our families, for our churches as a corporate body, that when we are asking God to meet our needs, that we have already sought the heart of God. We've already sought the mind of God, and so that we can be confident that what we are asking Him to do is in accordance with His will. Because there are times that God says, okay, I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you what you're asking for, but you're not going to like it when you get it. Because I want you to learn, I want you to understand that my ways are the best ways. You're going to give them what they want, but they're not going to want what they get. We see God working in the lives of His people like that throughout the Old Testament. There are times that God responds by granting their requests, even when they're asking for something outside of His will. This is one of those occasions. You have to wonder what things would have been like if they had not so adamantly demanded to have a king. How would the story of history have unfolded if God had not given them what they were asking for? You see, we never know how our disobedience affects not only our lives, but also the lives of the people around us. And not just for this generation, but for generations to come. Let's think about the big picture. The Old Testament is the story of God dealing specifically with His people, Israel. We see mankind's disobedience. We see mankind's rebellion. We see a story of disappointment. How God created all of this, and it was very good, he said. And almost immediately, man says, I know, God, this is what you told us to do, but we're going to disobey. We got better plans. We know better than you. It was also a story of redemption. We see it in the garden when God promises that he will send a Savior who will crush the head of the serpent. We see it in the meantime in the sacrificial system where God is giving this picture of forgiveness, of the shedding of blood for the forgiveness of sin. A picture of forgiveness that would be perfected in Messiah. We see it in the words of the prophets later on as they are all talking about looking forward to the coming Messiah. And so the big picture of God's will is how everything built to the coming of Jesus. Now, we know because we are on this side of the story, we're looking back over those events and we know how God did that. We know that God, in his sovereignty, chose to bring Jesus into the world as a person through the line of King David. Let that sink in for a moment. God didn't want him to have a king. And yet Jesus came into the world through the line of King David. From the opening pages of Genesis, it was God's will to bring Jesus into the world. And we know that he did this through David, but God never wanted them to have a king. How can both of those statements be true? I don't know. This is one of those things that I look at and I'm like, that's outside of my ability to comprehend. It is part of the mystery of how God works through the lives of imperfect people. People who often make bad choices. And a God who is perfect and is sovereign to accomplish his will in spite of that. It's the essence of what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. From time to time, we meet people like Johnathan. And God uses to kind of bridge the rebellious demands, the sin, the rejection of his people with the ultimate purpose of God. Remember, God did not want them to have a king. They begged God for one, and he gave them what they wanted, even though he knew they were not going to like what they got. And yet God used those terrible choices that his people made and said, okay, I'm going to turn this into something beautiful. I'm going to bring beauty out of these ashes. I'm going to bring something. I'm going to choose. I was always going to send Jesus into the world. I'm going to choose to send Jesus into the world, not through the one that they first chose to be the king, but from the one who succeeded him. And without Johnathan, David might have never become king. The Bible is filled with stories of ordinary people like Johnathan, whom God used in extraordinary ways to accomplish his purpose. You know what? God still does that. He looks for ordinary people like you and me to do extraordinary things today. God delights in this. You know why God delights in using just ordinary people to accomplish these kinds of things? Because then he gets the glory, and we don't. See, there's something about our flesh that when we feel like that we've got it all together, when we feel like that we're the smartest person in the room, when we feel like that we're the strongest person in the room, when we got all of the answers to all of the questions, it's easy for us to then think, well, look what I did. God says, no, that's for me. That's for me. God delights in this. Some people long for power. They strive for prestige. They desire to be an extraordinary person. God calls us to be an ordinary person in the hands of an extraordinary God who desires to use us in extraordinary ways. That was Johnathan. And as we look at his story, we see the shaping of this godly man And the way we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at Johnathan in contrast with his father. So you have Samuel, who is this prophet, who is a godly man who's led Israel for decades as a faithful servant of God. And yet his sons are wicked. Well, then you have Saul, who we're going to see is a pretty, I don't know that I would say he's wicked. Well, yeah, God actually says he's wicked later on, and we'll look at that too. But he is less than godly, and yet his son is a godly man. Johnathan was probably a teenager when his father was chosen to be the king of Israel. We met the family in 1 Samuel chapter 9. Saul's father, or Jonathan's father Saul, sent on this mission to find his father's missing donkeys. And we get the description of him that he is a man who is handsome. Not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he, from his shoulder upward. He's taller than he is the tallest person in the room. He's the strongest person in the room. He's the best looking person in the room. When he walked into a room, not only all of the women said, "Wow, there's Saul," but all of the men said, "Wow, there's Saul. He's impressive." He's everything the people wanted in a king. He looked the part. His journey to find his father's missing donkeys led him to Samuel, the man of God. Saul hoped that Samuel would tell him where to find the donkeys, and ultimately he did, but before he pointed Saul in the direction of the donkeys, he delivered some shocking news. 1 Samuel chapter 9, he says, "Saul, you are the hope and the desire of Israel. The Lord has anointed you to be prince over his people Israel." I was just looking for donkeys. What? And just like that, Saul's life was changed. Just like that, the life of his family was changed, including his son, Johnathan. He may have looked the part of a king, but almost immediately we began to see his flaws. He may have been a striking figure of a man, but he was terribly insecure. Get this, church. He had physical strength, but he lacked the inner strength of character to lead and to rule God's people. Saul was weak. And so even on the day that he was to be introduced to the people as their king, turn the page to chapter 10. Join me in looking at verse 20. Then Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. He brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its clans, and the clan of the Matrites was taken by lot, and Saul the son of Kish was taken by lot. But when they sought him, he could not be found. So they inquired again of the Lord, "Is there a man still to come?" And the Lord said, "Behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage." He's the biggest, baddest person around. He's been told that God anointed him to become king. And on the day that he is to be crowned, he's hiding. So they ran and took him from there, and when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from the shoulders upward. And Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There's none like him among all the people." And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." By the way, if you had any doubts about how God really felt about the whole thing, look back just a few verses before verse 20, where God says through Samuel on the day of Saul's coronation, "But today you have rejected your God who saved you from all your calamities and your distresses. And you have said to him, 'Set a king over us.'" One more chance to end their rebellion. One more chance to hear the word of the Lord and say, "Okay, God, I know we said we wanted that, but before we make this mistake, let us think about it a little bit longer. Lord, let us do the right thing here." They can either embrace the rule of a perfect and loving God or submit to the rule of what would become a weak and insecure king. And even when he was hiding in the baggage, they could have said, oh, wait a minute, that is not king material. But they were so blinded by their own personal desires, their own insecurities, their own disobedience. They plowed through. But God had a plan. God always has a plan. We look at some situations and we go, okay, God, I know you've got a plan, but you don't know what to do with this situation. No, that never happens. God always has a plan, and God is always accomplishing His purposes. Look, we cannot stop the purposes of God. We can take ourselves out of the blessing of being a part of the purposes of God, but God will accomplish His purposes. The only choice is, are we going to be a part of it or not? Even though Israel had made this decision, it did not in any way change God's plan. And God's plan involved Saul's son, Johnathan. Almost immediately, 1 Samuel chapter 13, Israel's ready to go to battle. And this is one of those situations where we're introduced to Johnathan because Saul has made him a captain in his army and has given him rule over 1,000 soldiers. Saul's taken rule of 3,000 soldiers, and they're about to go to battle against the Philistines. And ordinarily what would happen in this situation is that the king, who had the largest number of troops, would lead the way in battle, but that's not what happened. 1 Samuel chapter 13, what we immediately discover is that it's not the king who leads out in battle, it is his son. What kind of a father does that? Son, I got you back. You go with 1,000, I got 3,000, but I got you back. No. What he should have done was taken the 3,000 and said, son, I need you to have my back. The 1,000 is the backstop. The 3,000 is the force. But Johnathan goes ahead and he defeats the Philistines. And in that we discover that he is something special. He is everything that his father is not. Not only was Saul weak and cowardly and all of those things, but he often acted in disobedience to the explicit commands of God. Before one battle, he refused to wait for the prophet to come and to offer the sacrifice of God before going into battle. Samuel had been summoned to come and to offer the sacrifice that would give them the blessing of God as they went into this battle. And as time went on, his soldiers and his commanders came to him and said, we can't wait. The time is now. And rather than saying, look, I'm the king, and I'm not going to move until I hear a word from the Lord, he said, okay, I'll offer the sacrifice myself. Against the explicit commands of God. Saul, you're not a priest. It's not your job to do that. In fact, it's just the opposite. You're violating God's command. He acted out of fear and he acted without faith. It's disobedience. Johnathan, on the other hand, continually showed just a simple trust in the Lord. On one occasion in 1 Samuel chapter 14, we find that Johnathan is alone with only his armor bearer. Just the two of them. And they come into contact with a garrison of Philistine soldiers. And they have an opportunity. Look at verse 6 of chapter 14. Johnathan said to the young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. Those are the words of a young man who is saying, Lord, I want you to order my steps. It may be that the Lord has put us in this position. We got two. They've got an entire garrison. Odds don't look pretty good there, do they? Not by human standards. But what Johnathan is saying is that if the Lord has brought us to this place and he comes up with this kind of plan to determine whether or not that is actually what's happening, he's not going to put himself in extreme danger. But essentially what he's saying is, how cool would it be if the two of us were able to take out this entire garrison of Philistine soldiers? It will only be able to be explained that God did it. We don't know how many Philistines there were in the garrison, but we know there were only 2 Hebrews present. We know that God gave them the victory that day, though. They killed 20 Philistines, and the panic that followed sent the enemy in full-scale retreat. Talk about confidence. Talk about strength. Talk about the shaping of a godly man. Johnathan acted in simple trust, knowing that God was leading him. Let me ask you a question. In the vernacular of South Alabama, we would have looked at Johnathan and his armor bearer and said, you guys are between a rock and a hard place. What do you do when you're between a rock and a hard place? How do we react? Do we react the way that Saul did and take matters into our own hands? Do we act impetuously? Do we fret? Do we fear? Or do we respond with a confident trust in God? God, I don't know exactly what you're up to here, but I do know that you do work all things together for good to those who love you and are called according to your purpose. And so, Lord, this opportunity is in front of us, and I don't know what you're gonna do, but I know you're gonna do something. It's kind of like the conversation that many of us have been having about what happened downstairs last week. Could it be that God is working through it? Could it be that that is actually a blessing? It's frustrating. It was messy last week. But could it be that it's actually a blessing? That God is saying, those things that y'all were talking about, this is what actually needs to happen. And see how I have worked through this to enable this to happen. We'll talk about that a little more later. When we're caught between a rock and a hard place, do we seek to know God's will? And are we able to recognize God's voice when we hear it? See, that only comes from having a personal relationship with God, walking by faith. It comes from trusting God time after time. It comes from prayer. And it results in obedience even when we don't understand. There's another occasion where Saul and his army were going to battle against the Amalekites this time. God's instructions were clear. Wipe out the enemy. No prisoners. No spoils of victory. Kill everything. Now, I gotta be honest. That's one of those passages of Scripture that, based on the way I view God, I take pause. And I say, okay, God, I don't really completely understand, but I'm not going to question your sovereignty here. God said, wipe everything out. Saul led his troops into battle and they won. But he did not kill the king of the Amalekites, nor did he destroy the king's herds. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 10 reads, the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. Disobedience disqualified him from service. But what follows that is part comical and part pitiful. Samuel goes to Saul and he says, Saul, did you do what I told you the Lord said for you to do? Did you wipe everything out? Saul says, sure did. Absolutely. And then Samuel says, then what is the bleating of sheep that I hear and the lowing of oxen? Saul was caught. But even then, he didn't take responsibility. He blamed the people. He said, they have brought them from the Amalekites For the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen, but they did it to offer sacrifices to God. In other words, we disobeyed, but we had good intentions. Listen to Samuel's response in verse 22. For Samuel chapter 15, verse 22. Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams, for rebellion is as the sin of divination." Remember earlier I said Saul was wicked, and then I said, well, maybe not. Well, yes, he was, because it just says that sin is just as wicked as the sin of divination. And presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord has also rejected you from being king. The mark of a godly man or woman is obedience. Obedience. Obedience when you don't understand. Obedience when you think you've got a better way. Saul thought he could go through religious motions and do whatever he pleased. And God said, you might as well be practicing witchcraft. Your sacrifices are empty. Your rituals are meaningless. Saul, the only thing I want you to do is listen to me. I want you to obey me. Church, hear me. That's all God wants from us. He wants us to listen to Him. He wants us to obey. Trust and obey. That was the secret to Johnathan's success. The lack of trust and obedience was the downfall of his father. And as a result, God rejected Saul and He anointed David to become king. Now think about Jonathan's role in this. He is caught in the middle. We know that Johnathan and David became fast friends. In fact, their love for one another was so great that it was more than a brother. So Johnathan has this great love for David. But who was next in line to become king after Saul? Johnathan. I mean, he was next guy up. And when God rejected Saul, He rejected the entire family because He anointed David to become king. God chose David. And then He used Johnathan to make it happen. Johnathan was the one who protected David from Saul's revenge. He spied on his father. He told David what Saul planned to do. Johnathan gave up his own rights to be obedient to what God asked him to do. Let that sink in. What are you willing to give up in order to be obedient to God's call on your life? It takes a man or woman of strong godly character to put aside our own ambitions to facilitate someone else's success. We all have agendas. We all have goals. We all have dreams. We have places to go, people to see. But there are times when God says, I want something more for your life. What are you willing to give up to be obedient to God's call on your life? What are you willing to give up for the sake of the gospel? Johnathan had no way of knowing that what he was giving up was actually facilitating God's ultimate plan of redemption for the world. Who knows? The sacrifices that we make in order to be obedient to what God tells us to do today, who knows what kind of difference that is going to make in eternity? God knows. He says to us, just listen to me and do what I say. Father, I'm reminded of the words of the young boy Samuel when he was ministering before the priest Eli. And he heard a voice, but he didn't know where it was coming. And each time he said, Lord, speak. Your servant is listening. Father, our response to you this morning, individually, as families, as a church, God, when we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place, Lord, speak. For your servant is listening. Father, we thank you.